Hi all, it's PJ and welcome to Bernina Quick Tips. This quick tip is about small lettering. What I have up on the screen here is the design for the Twisty, which is the August Embroidery Club project. You can add personalization to the Twisties, and it's going to take pretty small lettering because there's not a lot of room to work. The small and the middle size are the same width, and then the larger side is actually a little bit wider, so you have more leeway on that to add your letters. I pulled it to 4 just because I'm going to show you a couple of different variations here of how you can deal with small lettering. So I have my design up. I'm going to go in and add, and I am going to go to my alphabet. What you can see here are all your different alphabets. Depending on the model machine you have, you may have more or fewer. One thing that's really nice on some of the models that have the vertical letters, these actually work great for this because you can end up using a larger size letter because it's the width that needs to fit in as opposed to the height. And let me just do this and I'll explain. Something to keep in consideration when you're choosing a font, the width of this font needs to be about 3/8 of an inch, which in embroidery terms is quite small. Depending on the font you choose, you really need to have something that is fairly simplistic, such as something like this. If you choose something like this, the little skinny bits are going to get so skinny you're not going to be able to even see them. And this actually didn't have quite enough bulk to even really show up. And I'll show you a sample of this and how I thought I was going to be able to kind of outsmart the system, but it didn't work, and I'll explain when I show you the sample. Fonts like this, again, there's just too much going on. This is a pretty good font, and I think this one actually worked well also. And I believe this one as well. This one, because you're going to get it so small, the satin stitches end up being a relatively decent size. This particular font in its default size works really well, but if you get it too big because the satin stitch is so wide, it's actually not a very good font for getting really big, but it's a pretty good one for getting small. So in this case, though, I am just going to start with this, and I'm going to come in here and choose this font. And I'm just going to use my initials so that you can see what's happening here. So there's my PJ, and I'm going to say OK to that. You can see when these come up, they're really quite big, and it's going to need to fit between here and here, and that distance is less than 1/2 of an inch. And right now, that is selected, and you can see down here that it's 0.8. So this is easily twice as large as what it needs to be. So the very first thing that I'll do is I'm just going to start shrinking that down. When it looks like it's roughly the right size, I can kind of move it up here into position. Oh, I can see it's still going to need to shrink some more. This will go a bit quicker on your actual machine because you can just spin your knob. At some point, you're going to need to zoom in on this so that you can see a bit better what's going on. So go into your zoom. If you're not familiar with your zoom, here's a really quick lesson. If the hand is selected, which is this little guy, and it's selected when it's the darker of the two colors, that will allow you to move on this part of the screen. You can see how that's moving into position. So when you move over here, the little window is going to give you what you're seeing. And then you could zoom in a bit more. And this is still selected, so I can move this over and get it a little more centered. And you can zoom in really pretty far. So you can see here I'm not quite centered. I'm going to go back over here, select that P. If I want to adjust where my design is, and I have this selected, and you can tell the other is grayed out. If I go to my 4-way arrow here and select that, that is now active. I can now move the design on the screen. So can you see me up in the little preview window? I'm moving that design, and then I can move this into position without having to go actually back out here and use my knobs or anything. I can just do that directly on the screen, which is to me really quite handy. That's still selected. I'm going to shrink that down just a little bit more because I'm really pretty close to my borders here still. So back into here. And there we go. So I could also just shrink that in width and not in height, but it's really up to you. So there's one option. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. I'm going to go back in. I'm going to choose this, and let's look and see how this one looks. And that's just kind of a nice block letter. So here's a couple tricks if your machine doesn't happen to have vertical letters. Here's an easy way to get vertical letters and get everything sized correctly. I have this. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of get that up into position to start with. And then I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to select my hand so I can move that down. I'm going to select this again. So obviously you can see here that's quite wide. What I'm going to look at initially is getting my P to the correct width from here to here. So once again, with that selected, I'm just going to size this. You could in fact take off your lock and only size your width. Can you see that how only the width is sizing? And you could leave your height the way that it was. I'm going to select my 4-way arrow here so that I can move this on my screen without going out of the zoom and see how I'm getting. So that's almost exactly that same width. And over here, this is the entire width of the design, not just that single letter. Back in here, I'm going to make that a little more narrow. I think that that is probably good. Maybe slightly smaller. You're better to have a little tiny bit of margin. Okay, so these are now sized the same, but obviously that J is not going to fit. With that layer selected, I'm going to go into my eye, and I'm going to choose my group and ungroup, and I'm going to ungroup that. So now my P is here and my J is here. With my 4-way arrow still selected, I'm just going to grab my J and move that down. You could then go and reconnect those so that they're all on the same layer. So there's a different option. Let's go look and see what happens if we go in here. So if I go into here and I say PJ, so there's my PJ. What happens if you want it to run in this direction? So the distance from here to here is really only 0.4. So in this case, my height is going to have to shrink down to 0.4. So let's see what happens when we do that. I'm going to do this symmetrically. And as I'm scaling this down, I'm watching what's happening here because this number is going to need to be less than 0.4. Because I'm going to rotate these letters sideways. You can see how small they're getting. So there's my 0.4. If I now move this up into position, I'm going to go ahead and rotate this. So there's my 90 degrees. Let's go ahead and zoom in. I want to get back to my hand so that I can move the window. There we go. I'll zoom in some more. So you can see if I select this height, well, since I've rotated it, now this is my height, this is my width. But that is basically at 0.4, which is the same as that width. So I'm still going to need to scale that down. So that's at 0.3 now. On this font, I think that that would probably work because you can still actually see that the stitching is going to be okay. This font is honestly one of my favorite fonts, but for this particular project, not a good choice. So we're going to scale this way down, and you'll see what happens. I'm going to scale this down so that it will fit turned in this same orientation. but you'll see what happens to the font when we get it that small. So we're at 0.5 here, and I'll zoom in a little bit more on that. So we need to get this down to about a 0.3. And actually, if we zoom way in, it's still looking like it's pretty well okay. But in reality, it may or may not be, because these at this stage of the game are going to be really, really, really small and tiny. I'm going to show you the stitch out of this, and you'll see that the first three worked really well. And on that last one that got really, really small, I ended up not even finishing the stitching because the machine was making such a horrible noise, because even though it was attempting to stitch that, it was just really too small. So here are the samples, and you can see those first three samples worked great. And even the one that is going sideways on the screen, it's going sideways. On the Twisty, it will actually be going down the length. Because that font had a fairly broad satin stitch, even when it got really small, it tended to work out pretty well. And it, in fact, does have a serif as well. Again, you really need to just do some test stitching and see what's going to work the best. Here are some other samples. Couple of these are the same fonts. This third font is actually the same as the third font on the other sample. I just did it vertically, and you can see again, even though those letters are a little bit bigger, they work perfectly well. The number 2 font on this one is the line stitch font, and I thought I was going to get very clever and just do it 3 times in a row. As it turns out, that font tends to backtrack on itself. So you can see on the J here, I actually did it twice, but at the longest part of the J, it's actually 4 times. So to me, it was pretty obvious right off the bat that that probably wasn't going to be a very good scenario. In the 4th position on this sample, these are asterisks, and you just kind of have to go through your fonts and see which ones will tend to work and which ones won't. When you chain them up together or put multiples of them, to me they tend to look like little flowers or just really a fun little decoration. That's it for this quick tip. We'll see you next time. Thanks. If you'd like to follow along, this project is available for purchase at the Montevilla Sewing Center's Teachable site. The project includes the full video, written instructions, design files, and more. You can purchase the projects by the month or join the club and save. To join the club, contact the main store. If you'd like to view the video preview for this project, go to my YouTube channel, A PJ Project, go to the playlist and choose the Machine Embroidery Club, and then choose the project.